Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are David Tucker, Customer Experience Strategist, and Shannon Cazeau, the Director of the Office of Policy Coordination. They are both in the Bureau of Global Talent Management at the State Department. Good to have you both with us. And we want to start with this idea of the client or the customer being the internal employee of the agency. And so give us a snapshot of what you are doing at State Department to kind of improve that customer experience for your employees who are all over the world. And maybe tell us a little bit about the vision for the Bureau of Global Talent Management itself.
Yeah, right now, as far as internal CX efforts go, we're doing all kinds of things. So we're reimagining services from the ground up. We've overhauled our intranet to make information more available, more findable, more accessible. We've been identifying ways to decrease burden and increase productivity using automation. And we also have a few global projects going on right now to enhance support to families across the world. And I'll hand it over to Shannon to talk about the vision.
Great, thank you. So I think, what's really important to understand about the State Department workforce is that we are truly global. And so we are present in over 250 posts abroad, as well as our domestic workforce. And our workforce is comprised of our Foreign Service officers who are primarily deployed abroad, but also serve in Washington, and then our Civil Service officers, and then our locally engaged staff, which is actually the largest part of our workforce. And so I mention that because in our system are built-in natural stress points, because we have frequent movement of employees, frequent changes of assignments. We have family members who come with us on those Foreign Service assignments. And they're often in very challenging situations, whether some of those are conflict areas or high stress situations. So there's a lot of challenges as we look at our global workforce and what that looks like in the 21st century with the challenges that we have ahead of us across the foreign policy landscape. So I think what's important to emphasize here is really, Secretary Blinken has come in with this vision of modernizing the Department of State. It's his modernization agenda with the idea of, how do we position this global workforce to meet the challenges of the 21st century? And so bringing it down to the Bureau of Global Talent Management, our job is to take care of our workforce and to provide, the enabling environment and the support services to enable our broad workforce to do their work. And so when we talk about the customer experience, we've actually sort of moved it into the employee experience. And that's a construct that we've been looking at. And we can talk about a number of different ways that we're doing that. But ultimately, it's about helping our employees bring their best selves to work. And we do that by making sure that the services and support that we provide from the Bureau of Global Talent Management and across the department enable employees to do that. So that's just kind of the broad strategic framework in terms of how we're thinking about it.
And just a detailed question, many of the overseas employees that work at the stations and embassies and so forth, those are sometimes foreign nationals who are employed locally by the United States. Is that fair to say?
Right. So that's why I was talking about the bulk of our workforce is actually our foreign national employees. So they are employed in the countries that they live in, and they are the bulk of our workforce at our embassies. And then we deploy our Foreign Service officers and their families to those embassies as well.
Yeah, so the implication is that the the employee experience, to some degree, may have to be tailored for different work styles, different cultural orientations, just different national ways that don't all mimic what's in Foggy Bottom, Washington, D.C., USA.
That's correct. So it's a very diverse workforce with diverse challenges. And even when you take it down to just very specific environments, and I've served in multiple embassies overseas, the challenges are unique to each of the countries that you're in, and the cultural sorts of issues. Sometimes host government, legal environment, there's all kinds of challenges that go into that. So everybody's experience is different, but at the same time, there is a dominant sort of understanding that we are the State Department and everybody is part of that.
Sure. And David, it sounded like you were talking about what I might call the removal of friction for people to be able to do their jobs. You mentioned access to data, different automation tools. Maybe give us a little more detail about, say, the type of data that might be typically needed by a foreign national or anybody, in the United States, and what you're doing to make that more findable and more available.
Yeah, so most of the data that we're working with right now focuses largely on HR services, but the stuff that we're collecting has to do with, I guess, how people are delivering them, delivering HR services, as well as how they are receiving them. And so we are using things. We recently had our first ever stay survey, which is looking at reasons why people might want to leave the department or might want to stay, and try to emphasize those things. We crowdsource solutions, we have focus groups, and we do a lot of these to understand first where to look. And then once we've identified particular frictions, particular sticky problems, then zooming in on those to try and improve the process, to try to make it more, more effortless or more emotionally resonant, because, these are busy people in, new environments every couple of years. And so whatever we can do to reduce the stress so they can focus on their work, that's where the GTM CX program comes in.
Right. So you really have to take a look at, say, the data requirements, not from the CIO standpoint or the technical staff standpoint, but what it is, how it looks from the employee standpoint, their point of view, as they do the jobs they're trying to do, whatever that might be.
Yeah, all of our requirements are driven by what our customers tell us. And so so that's the data that we're working with. That said, the practices that we're bringing into that, the CX team comes in with a wealth of knowledge pertaining to qualitative and quantitative research. And as we go through these processes and we work with different teams to bring them through that, and they move on to their next assignments, it can help build capacity for doing their own evaluation when they go to their onward post.
Got it. And Shannon, anything to add there?
Yeah, what I would add, Tom, so it's interesting because I'm new to the CX landscape. These are new resources that we have at the department, and we actually have 3 customer experience experts within GTM, and they're actually like David, well, David's one of them, but on our team in the policy coordination office. And I've learned so much just by watching about how they think about things and how it's a different approach to the way we do business. And I'll give you an example. David mentioned our stay survey, which was a super powerful tool. We had a 36% response rate, which gave us a less than 1% margin of error, and really targeted feedback that we're able to look at. But one of our other customer experience strategists, Chris Atkins, he's been doing work with us in our retention unit. And so we were trying to figure out a way to have a more robust dialogue with employees. So not just the stay survey, but let us drill down and have a conversation about some of these issues. And so he took that and then came back with a totally different approach I had never thought about. And he said, okay, this is what human-centered design looks like. If you'll let me do this, I want to run with this, focused roundtable kind of discussion, but it's not going to be a session where everybody highlights the challenges, which is tended to be kind of how we just have these conversations. We have a listening session, and then we hear what our employees are telling us. And so what Chris said is human-centered design is about having them articulate those challenges, but then tell us how would they solve it. And that totally changed the discussion. I think both from the perspective of the work we were doing in GTM, but also from the perspective of the employees who, when you do it that way, there's all of a sudden this light bulb that goes off that says, well, wait a minute, I could be part of the solution, or here's the way I would change it. And importantly, it also makes them think through how difficult the landscape is. So instead of bringing a problem to you, they have to start working backwards and think about, well, yeah, how would I solve that? And so that kind of approach has provided this really rich dialogue with the workforce, where they're part of the conversation about not only identifying the challenges that we have, but how would you solve them? And it makes them think about that too. So it totally changed the way I even thought about how we would engage with employees. And that was a direct reflection of having the CX approach on our team.
Yeah. So, David, would it be fair to say that for people that are customer experience strategists, such as yourself, one of your premises then is simply engaging people and asking the question, even before you change anything, might actually improve engagement and interest. And that would help you accelerate that whole process of improving employee experience.
When it comes to customer experience, human-centered design is inextricable to any type of effort or intervention we might have to improve a process, to improve a service, or even just to improve engagement with employees. And it's about meeting them where they are, which I know might be kind of a cliche to people that are attending this summit, but that's really what it's about. It's kind of understanding, not just what the problems are, but what's the context in which they are trying to deliver something or they're trying to receive something. And then, the context in terms of their office, the context in terms of their greater environment. If they're at a mission overseas and it's a particularly difficult environment and say they're dealing with, moving their belongings from one place to the next, then, it's a whole different set of considerations. And you really have to be able to understand that to come up with a sustainable solution that really will address the very core needs.
Sure. And Shannon, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned, and that is that you moved some of the work being done in customer experience into employee experience. And so I wanted to talk about the interplay of those two. It seemed like almost like a double helix with each side feeding on the other side all the time. And, people forget that the State Department has a gigantic retail operation, for lack of a better word. For anyone that wants to set foot out of the United States, you need one of those little blue books. And so that's often, I think, overlooked in thinking about diplomacy mission and so on. And so maybe talk more about that idea of EX feeding CX and vice versa.
So I think, what we came to, and this is partly an evolution as we've, been working, I was working on the retention piece and then exposed to our CX colleagues, and then we ended up bringing it all together because it made sense. It was two sides of the same coin. And I think, to this point, and what I've learned from our CX team is they talk a lot about the backstage, the backstage being, and David can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but the backstage being, the employees themselves. So those who are the service providers, those who are providing the services. If we do a better job of taking care of their needs in that backstage, they're going to in turn do a better job of taking care of the needs of the customers that they're serving. So that was also a different way of thinking about it. So when you think about that kind of employee experience, if we're improving the employee experience broadly across the institution, that's going to have a net impact both on our internal customers and then to your point about the external customers. And I'll give you an example of that. At the work that David and his colleagues have done on our permanent change of station process, which if you ask any foreign service officer has been one of the most long-standing, bureaucratic, painful points in the employee experience. And we do it every couple of years. Mm-hmm. But I think what was lost in that conversation was the understanding of what the impact of that was. So if you talk about a PCS process, and we look at it from the employee experience standpoint, any transition, this is one of the most stressful points in an employee's life cycle. You're moving not just yourself, but in many cases, your entire family. You're going to a different country. You're going to, or you're re-entering the United States, which is equally challenging. And so that bureaucratic process and the hiccups and the delays and the customer service piece of it, there was no understanding that delay then delayed being able to get your kids enrolled in school or do the kinds of things that you needed to do to keep moving forward in that PCS process. So David and his colleagues looked at that whole PCS process, made a number of innovations in it. We're now at an 86 to 90% satisfaction rate. We're getting emails in saying, oh my gosh, I don't know what you did, but this is amazing. And it's a great example. So everybody going overseas, that's that outward facing, that's how we provide that service. But it changes how the employee is experiencing the department in that process. And then the other piece I would add is, and David, correct me if I'm wrong, but our Bureau of Consular Affairs, which of course has that huge external service orientation, has hired their own CX strategists. So it's starting to, kind of take off in the department as a whole, as the institution recognizes the value that that it brings to the work we're doing.
All right. So, David, the people getting moved, the customers who are employees getting moved around said, I don't know what you did, but it's so much better. Maybe tell us what you did do.
Yeah, so, we worked really closely with the team, with the office that manages that process. And they of course, understand it better than everybody. They understand where things break down. They can see, almost with foresight at this point, like a sixth sense. They know where something's going to go wrong, or where things can go smoothly as well. And so we worked together with them to just map their whole process, to look at those individual points, and then we worked on everything from how staffing is organized to how they take intake of requests for information. Most of the initiation of the process is done through a web-based application, but they get a lot of inquiries. We looked at documentation. We worked on customer service training, and it was all part of this coordinated plan to make the travel order process easier and quicker and less cumbersome. And as Shannon was saying, people really responded to it, and we were really excited about that. And not only that, we were able to take, when we look at future projects we can work on, we were able to take what we've learned from that experience. And right now we're applying a similar approach to the office that oversees contracts and resource requests and logistical support. And we'll work through that one, and then we plan to take what we learned from that to apply it to future projects. And so it goes on and on with new learning and scalability.
It sounds like you could teach the Department of Defense a few things, because they also move thousands and thousands of people a month all over the world.
Yeah, I won't speak to their capabilities, but I'm sure it's a challenge. Yeah.
All right. And let's get to the issue of measurement, because you really need metrics to know whether a measure is working or to know if there's a pain point. As you mentioned, David, internally, the people that are running this process of moving people around, to continue with that example, they know where the friction points are going to happen. They can almost anticipate it. But a little data goes a long way, I guess, in understanding what you need to fix and what people's experience actually is, to the extent it can be quantified. And especially online experiences can be quantified a great deal. So let's talk about data and analytics to get insight for the whole idea of improving the employee experience.
Yeah, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of the data that we have for starting these projects is coming from surveys. It's coming from direct interaction with would-be users or would-be customers moving through a process. Moving forward with that, we've been able to start to collect data from other places as well. At the service level, we've started to put in some Likert scale style surveys at the end of a service in our online case management process, and use that to evaluate, just in a simple way, how people feel about the service that they just took on, and then using that to prompt if it needs further evaluation. And we're starting to broaden that out to more and more services. And then we also do follow-up surveys with people to see if we've moved the needle on their sentiment around processes. And for some of the things that we've been doing when it comes to organizing information internally, a lot of a big effort of ours has been just trying to wrangle information, because there's just so much of it. We're involved all over the world, and the way that we handle things internally, we've set up processes that start to organize and structure data when it comes in for requests or for tracking. And then from that, we're able to do data analysis to see, to use that to inform future actions, future iterations of a policy or future iterations of a service. And it's been really helpful. So a lot of that is being built from the ground up, but it's definitely moving along.
Yes, because surveys can tell you what people think about it, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily improving it if you can somehow convince them to feel better about it. And I'll just as I'm making up this example, but suppose in the process of moving, it takes, 4 days for the movers to respond to something.
Mhm.
Maybe people think, well, that's what it takes for movers, so I'm not that unhappy. But you can see that metric regardless of a survey and say, well, let's get it down to 2 days or let's
Yep.
get it down to 20 minutes, that kind of thing. So
Mhm.
you both survey people then and also look at the metrics of a sub process to try to understand what's really going on
Mhm.
other than people's perceptions of it.
Absolutely. And Shannon mentioned the backstage aspect of it too. So we're looking at it on both sides. So, if we get it down to, like, say we had something that took 5 days and we get it down to 2, if that's causing such a burden on the backstage side that people are stressed out or that things start slipping through the cracks, then that's not a sustainable solution either. And so we're evaluating it on both sides to try to make sure that, we're striking a good balance so that we're able to deliver, to get people to their onward post, to get people working and focused on their job as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible, but not at the expense of our HR employees. Yeah, because we want to keep them too.
Yeah, well, you don't make one group happy at the expense of another group because
Absolutely.
that's not real productivity. That's just, the opposite of that.
Mhm.
Shannon, then it strikes me then that there's a huge intra-agency aspect to all of this work because it's not just the customer experience or even the global talent management unit that can effectuate these things. You need the help of the moving staff, the IT staff, the whatever it might be staff that, I mean, everyone's interconnected in that sense.
Yes. So I would kind of widen the aperture a little bit. So part of the work that we've been doing on the retention piece of it, and so these were actually two separate efforts. You had the retention piece and you had the CX piece, and now they're together, as I explained before, because it made sense to bring them together. But the retention piece is under the Secretary's modernization agenda. And so we established, and I really think this is innovative across the federal government, we established a retention unit to really look at our workforce and who was leaving, who was staying, what were the reasons they were staying, and what were the reasons that we were going. So in addition to our status survey, we do exit interviews, which we've now integrated our CX strategists into doing those interviews with us so they can hear that employee feedback on the way out the door. In addition to our employee experience roundtables. But the retention, and this is where we focused on the employee experience overall. So it touches on these very, what I would call administrative processes, the administrative burden, which I think is what David has been talking about in terms of the very specific kinds of projects to address those administrative burdens. But the retention piece also looks at holistically at the employee experience. So it's everything from, mental well-being to job satisfaction, which touches on some of these administrative issues to, your belief in the mission, mission and purpose, career growth and mobility. So another way to think about it and measure it, to your point, is, you might have an employee, you get the PCS process down to 2 days, and they're never going to be happy with the 2-day PCS process. They think it should be 1 day. And then you still have other people who are happy with the 4-day process, just as an example. The way I would look at it from our stay survey, which is something that we hope to continue to do so we can measure progress, is there are a number of questions in there that get at that administrative burden. So overall, if our employees feel like that administrative burden is getting better, is diminishing, then that's reflective of these broader efforts. So you've got different pieces of this, but to an employee, they may not, necessarily, want to provide direct feedback on a PCS process, but what they are focused on is, how much of time in my day am I spending on my core work that I've been sent to do versus trying to get my kids set up in school or get my, vehicle out of, customs or whatever it is. And so that's another way to kind of measure it and think about it. So some of it may be very invisible to the workforce, and that's okay, because ultimately what you're trying to do is improve that overall experience.
Yeah, that's interesting because people can feel good about working at an organization and want to stay there if they get the sense that it's geared around their experience and geared around helping them fulfill their career goals, even if it's maybe not the greatest on the administrative side, because a place can be super slick on the administrative side, but not really culturally supportive of their career goals and getting the mission done. And so all of that automation may not help you that much when it ultimately comes to retaining your best people.
Right. So it's what the way I see it is that CX piece is a vital part of that whole kind of construct, but you look at the employee as a whole. And the other thing I would say is, I mean, we are the State Department. Our mission is diplomacy, foreign policy. And at the end of the day, diplomacy is a people business. That's the only way to get it done. And so if it's our people who are out there doing that business, then thinking about how we support them in doing it is really, really important. And we're not like other agencies where, you know, you've got lots of resources or programmatic and support. It's all about, it's a people to people business. And so we have to support the people out there who are doing the work.
I heard a story many years ago of people from a tribe in a distant country who were purported to be helped by the United States. And one of the leaders there was complaining that it wasn't very culturally sensitive. And this was a long time ago. And these people were very particular about hygiene, and the United States delivered toothbrushes. And they said, well, that was great, except that's not what we use in our culture. We use toothpicks or wooden types of implements, and we're just as clean as you are. Don't bring us toothbrushes. Which gets to the question of your foreign nationals. It may not be quite that extreme around the world that are working for the State Department, but how do you inculcate cultural differences, cultural norms, and expectations with common processes running in the background? I mean, that seems like a major challenge.
Yes, I would say so. And in the work that we're doing, I mean, I think we are very much focused right now because these are all new initiatives. So right now, you know, we're focused primarily domestically, but then as we build, so we're working towards the department's retention strategy, and the CX part of that will be important as well. You know, thinking about what does that look like again for a global workforce. And having served in several missions and been in a variety of different cultures, what I would say is there's always, you know, the culture of the embassy itself is, it is the US government. And so there's a lot of kind of core ways that we do business that actually are really valued and appreciated in the places where we work, where it may be different than the host government, and where our foreign our locally engaged staff are incredibly helpful. They're incredibly helpful in many areas, but one is figuring out how to bridge that gap with the place that we are, you know, and to reinforce the strengths of how we do business and, you know, our values and the things that we bring to the table, and reinforce those in the work that we do both inside the mission as well as the work we do outside the mission. So an example of that, and I've served most of my career on the African continent, is a perfect example would be the work that we do on accessibility in the mission. You know, making sure that our building, our facility is accessible, that we provide an accessible environment for all of our employees. And then the foreign policy piece of that, and you know, the way we work outside the mission is how do we reflect those same values in the place where we are, where those accessibility issues may not yet be at the level that that we would hope. And so there's ways that, you know, we kind of bridge it that way as well.
And let's get back to that retention question. And David, I wanted to ask you, you know, how do you prioritize what projects you think will improve employee experience, what might be borrowed from the CX side to apply to retention? And how do you know where to go first? Because a given employee's life, daily life, is just a myriad of processes, encounters, experiences, touching technology, touching people.
Yeah, it's we're now that we've come together as in the policy coordination unit, we're starting to coalesce around ways that we're going to prioritize things bureau-wide. Previously, the CX strategists, we've been in separate offices, and the priorities would usually come from issues that had been identified as particularly pressing ones by the leadership of those offices. Looking at the broader bureau and all of the different processes and services that we touch, we're going to look and see, you know, in a conversation with other leadership and other stakeholders, where we think we can make the biggest impact. But right now, that's a work in progress. And I don't know, Shannon, if you wanted to add anything to that.
So one of the things we've talked about, and this is again in the context of the retention work, if we look at what are the biggest sorts of issues that the workforce has raised, and one of them, I mean, there's several, but one is workload. And so, you know, this is a prime example of an area where our CX strategists can be so useful and creative, because when you're talking about federal government and the State Department, we have finite resources. You know, we're not the private sector. You can't fix workload challenges by hiring more people necessarily. I mean, there's limits to how you do that. But what you can do is think about efficiencies that we can get, or, you know, what sorts of new technological platforms can we use? Where are those processes inefficient? And it, you know, we've talked about things like, you know, logistics, but it's also our clearance process. How do we move paper? How do we get approvals in the building? How much time does that take? Where can you streamline those processes? How can you do things differently in terms of, you know, how we move things and get approvals and think about policy. So there's so many applications. So when we talk about workload, what we've talked about just preliminarily is, you know, how could we look at even our own work processes within the Bureau of Global Talent Management and innovate some efficiencies there, and then model that, show that to other parts of the institution who are looking for solutions as well. They're looking to solve the same problems. We're all doing similar work, different work, but similar. And so if you can show, okay, well, we had our CX team look at this, here's a different way we could do it, and we've introduced this much efficiency as a result of that. So that's another kind of example of the way that that can be applied. So it's also, you know, it's part of it is that service piece of it to the employees themselves, but there's the processes that the employees, all of our employees, participate in, and how can we make those better?
And David, something you said quickly, I think is really important in this context. You mentioned that earlier the customer experience strategists were assigned to different pieces, and now you're working together kind of as a team. And earlier you said that you don't want to be improving the experience of one group at the expense of making another one run through their treadmill that much faster. And so it seems like the only way you could possibly get this done is to work together and say, well, if we do this on the acquisition planning side, you know, what will this do to the contracting officers? Or if we do this on the moving office side, what will that do to the IT people? Yeah, I mean, there's a million possible combinations there, but is that part of the thinking, to make sure that you're holistic by joining together, even though you might be looking out of different windows, you can see the effect of what one does on the other person's group?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, coming together as a team has been very good. I think there was a lot of value, though, in having that initial experience and working in different teams, because we were exposed to different facets of GTM's work. And so one colleague, Misha Goring, she was focused on our executive office. So a lot of things that touched technology solutions and policy coordination, you know, other things that looked across the entire bureau. I was in an office that looked particularly at foreign service bidding and assignments. So the way that assignments are made, the way that positions are filled, and then all of the things that go along with that. So my job had more, in that role, had more interaction with bureaus that were trying to fill positions, with foreign service employees that were trying to figure out, you know, what different things meant for their career, and working on a whole different set of processes. But then when we would talk to each other, then we would kind of understand where all of those interrelated factors were, and we're able to bring those different perspectives and then know who to ask about things, because obviously we aren't going to know it all, nor should we. But you know, just having that kind of exposure really helps. I guess just like you said, thinking about it as in its totality.
And one of the big modernization efforts of State Department over the years and recent years has been its IT infrastructure. And there's been this move to the cloud and so forth, and lots of other pieces to make it easier for employees to work. It strikes me that's kind of a common cross-cutting enabler for almost anything you do. Fair to say?
Yeah, with the pandemic, actually, we had kind of a mini revolution when it came to technology. Um, uh, for the first time, a large portion of State Department was working remotely. We were using a lot of different remote technologies, kind of taking a, fully remote or in some cases hybrid posture, and figuring out how to incorporate all those different technologies into our daily life, while also taking into the consideration a lot of the security factors that all government agencies have, but especially for a foreign affairs agency, it can be particularly sensitive. Um, so we actually came in right as that was ramping up, right? Because we all got here around the middle of the first year of the pandemic.
Well, just a lot of capacity had to be added and a lot of enablement had to be added to make people able to telework, I suppose.
Absolutely.
And that residue is still with us, right? I mean, not everyone is plowing into the building anywhere anymore, are they?
Yeah, we're still, at a hybrid posture. I think that the State Department is, in some ways well equipped for that because we're used to working with people on other sides of the world. We're used to needing to make a phone call that's 12 time zones away, and needing to collaborate across time and space. And so the technology served more as a conduit for that. And as we've had more of it roll out and more of it integrated into our daily work, we figured out new and creative ways to embrace it, to take other people's ideas and bring them in and kind of build capacity on that front.
And how do you get buy-in from leadership? Because when you think of the employee experience and retention, you think of the, I don't know, GS-13, the equivalent, for State Department and lower. But then you've got a managerial layer that has something to say about how things work. And I guess this is more of a cultural and human relations question than a technical CX question, but you got to get buy-in right from the leadership and executive levels in order to proceed with what might be happening for benefiting the large numbers of people below them. How do you approach that? What's the best way? What's your advice for people at any agency watching this and saying, yeah, you got to keep them in mind too?
Well, on that regard, we've been very fortunate that the department's leadership on their own have been supportive of the customer experience program, and how it plays into broader employee experience and, modernization and inclusivity and all these different things overall. I mean, that starts at the top with Secretary Blinken, but, our head of management, John Bass, our head of HR, Marcia Bernicat, and her predecessor, Carol Perez, as well as a lot of the leadership throughout the Bureau of Global Talent Management. There's just been a lot of nascent support, and so we haven't had to fight for it. I would say probably the biggest challenge that we've had working with different parts of the leadership is that it's just awareness of it. But once they are able to see the benefits of the program, we've had really good buy-in, and we're very fortunate about that. I think through that, they've helped us by bringing us into digital projects that we've used for improving case management, for example. They've been encouraging people to try automation, which helps us look at introducing that as a possibility when we're engaging with different teams. And it also helps raise the visibility of the customer experience and employee experience programs when trying to work across organizational silos.
Yeah. So any good stories, Shannon, that have been, that's coming out of this whole retention EX effort? Because, State Department, much as you want to modernize, is an agency with deep traditions going back to the founding of the Republic. I mean, last I heard, the diplomatic pouch of paper with the wax seal is still a thing.
Yes. So a couple things I would add, to David's points. We're in this period of culture change at the department. And so when you talk about kind of buy-in from senior leadership, I think it starts with senior leadership. And as David said, we've been very lucky in that sense. But, the modernization agenda, that's the secretary's agenda. That's where it starts. And, even on the retention work that we're doing, it's part of, it was, his thing in the modernization agenda. But one of the things that I talk about is we talk about this kind of culture change, and culture change is hard. But and this is in the work of retention, what we've seen is the entire US workplace is at an inflection point in terms of workplace culture. And some of that, much of it, was kind of sparked by the pandemic, in the sense that the pandemic was a catalyst. But it's not because of the pandemic. All that did was accelerate sort of the demand signals and the need to think about work differently and do work differently and think about our organization differently. And so I think and I say, I've been with the department over 20 years. I'm a senior officer. I'm part of that cadre that has been, in part of the culture that we've had for a long time. But my peers across the institution, what I see is we're all sort of driving toward this. How do we do it differently? And when you think about it in the context of retention and recognizing that we want to have a workforce that is 100% representative of the rich diversity of the United States, are we positioned as an organization to have an employee experience that encourages that diversity, that we're able to truly be representative and to be nimble and to be flexible as a global workforce? So just as an example, we have this community of interest that we established as part of our retention work. And when we started, we had about 200 people. We're now at over 1,000. And those are 1,000 peers in our workforce who are saying, I care about the issues around the employee experience. And what you see is organic conversations and dialogue about, hey, I'm trying this. Have you tried, this other thing? And I think back to one of your earlier points about how do you do this across a global workforce? The reality is that we are a very mobile workforce. So these ideas start to move in the organization. People don't stay in the same place. So you can go, and I was out in Embassy Ouagadougou when the pandemic hit. Now I'm back in Washington. I will be back out in another embassy. And you take these skills and new approaches and things that you've learned and bring that, elsewhere. And so we're seeing lots of innovation, lots of great ideas. And then the last point I would make about the pandemic and the tools that we're using in the technology, in an ironic kind of way, we were always a global workforce, but because of these virtual platforms, we now are communicating in real time in a way that I don't think we did before. You're able to have a conversation about, whatever workforce innovation you're trying to implement, and you're having multiple embassies participate, and you're having, colleagues from across the world participate and being part of that conversation. That's different. We weren't doing that before.
Fascinating. Great stuff. And David, we'll end with you. What's on the horizon for the year ahead?
On the horizon for the year ahead, we are really looking forward to fleshing out our retention strategy. Taking the results from the STAY survey and a lot of the efforts that are surrounding that, and digging into some of those broader themes that Shannon mentioned earlier. Looking at things like workload, looking at things like impact on families, and accountability, things like that. And so we're really excited about having the insights and the opportunity to dig into those themes and really start to ramp up from at a higher level within the policy coordination office, the CX efforts as parts of employee experience going throughout the department.
All right. Lots of exciting things going on at the State Department, that's for sure. David Tucker is a customer experience strategist at the State Department. Shannon Cazeau is the director of the Office of Policy Coordination. They are both with the Bureau of Global Talent Management at the State Department. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.
And I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio for more on the Customer Experience Exchange.